Hello and welcome to the Genuine Learning Blog. My name is Melissa Galasso, and today we have a pretty big proposed standard to look at. It is over 200 pages long. I'm going to barely scratch the surface today. However, I am going to be a little longer than normal. I try to keep everything under 7 minutes, but today I'm just not sure that's possible given the size and the complexity of what we're about to talk about. So risk assessment has been an issue for some time. It's been at the top of the Enhancing Audit Quality Initiative areas of focus for the last few years. AICPA has spent a lot of time in this area, and they are now proposing some pretty significant changes to risk assessment. So proposed changes to the risk assessment standards. Let's dive on in. So this came out in August of 2020. Comments are due November 25th. So it's almost a 90-day comment period. So hopefully firms will actually take the time to respond. This is a pretty big proposal. It does have some changes in here. It is predominantly a convergence with the IAASB. So the IAASB have already completed their standard, which is going to be the new ISA 315, will be effective for periods beginning on or after December 15, 2021. So that would be calendar 22 year end would be their first shot at this. So they've issued their standard. It's our turn now to look at the changes that they made and then see what we want to adopt. Remember, we do keep someone from the ASB on the IAASB board. So it is not something that we are, just waiting for them to do and then we're going to look at. We actually actively participate in the international standard setting so that we reduce differences at that point as opposed to waiting till we do it at the US. And so they've been following this for some time and now we're ready to talk about it. So not trying to make fundamental changes here. So while it is a lot of change, it's not changing our key ideas that underlie our risk assessment, right? We still have control risk, we still have inherent risk, we still have to identify the risk of material misstatement. Those basic concepts aren't changing. Fundamentally, that's a sound way of performing an audit, that you identify your risk and then you respond to those risks by performing further audit procedures. That is not changing. However, what they are trying to do is clarify and to improve in certain areas. So there's been a lot of misinterpretation of the standards. There's been confusion around certain standards. And so what they're trying to do is be responsive and say, okay, well, clearly we didn't write this well the first time. If this is a huge area of focus, what can we do to make this better? One area they also focused on was scalability. We recognize that not every, it's not a one-size-fits-all audit, right? It doesn't work that way. However, it's not based on size. So under the extant standard, we focus on considerations specific to smaller entities, thinking that size is really the driver. And what we're really saying is not size. You can have a really small company that's incredibly complex. I've actually seen quite a few of them, entities that have entered into transactions that are much more complex than a typical entity. And I've seen large entities that have pretty basic business plans. So it's not size that's the driver of complexity or the driver of scalability. It's the level of complexity. So the complexity is going to decide how we scale our risk assessment procedures instead of focusing on size. So there is a concept of what is going to be a simpler version, and it's actually even compared to a more complex version. However, that's going to be in the application material. The other area that they do focus on is some modernization. We recognize that now we have automated tools and techniques and data analytics, and they can be used for risk assessment. They're not necessarily only being used in further audit procedures. And so I've actually seen a lot of this work in some of the efficiency courses that I've been working with Donnie Shimamoto on, which is it's not just for further audit procedures. And so how can we think about them from the concept of being in the risk assessment? So looking at the complex nature, technology, changes in the economy and regulations are impacting risk assessment. And then using these additional tools and techniques. And because the importance of IT, right? Everyone uses IT. Today, because of COVID, right? Zoom is growing in use. Kids are doing all of their learning online, right? Technology is a fundamental part of how we do business. And the standards really needed to reflect the importance of IT. And so we know if we look, there was a recent article out there that firms are not hiring hiring accounting majors, right? There's been a significant drop in accounting major hiring, but a huge increase in other majors, IT and data being two areas of focus, right? If we're going to look at how we're going to do the audit of the future, it's not just the accounting, it's the IT skills. And you're going to see a huge focus here on really understanding the IT. You can't sort of dance around the system anymore. You can't audit around the system. You're going to have to understand the IT. And so we're going to see that growth in this IT area. We also know the importance of professional skepticism, consistent with the other standards recently that came out, 142 and 143. This proposal is going to really try to drive professional skepticism as the key feature here, right? Instead of just being accepting, really pushing on. So you're going to notice in the introductory material, you're going to see clarifications about what it is that we're going to consider. They're going to talk about highlights of some of the benefits, and then it's also going to talk about contradictory evidence, something that came up in the evidence standard. So one of the things you're going to notice here is some definitional changes. And so I think this is probably one area that we are going to have to get used to some new terms, some revised definitions, and a system of internal control is going to be the focus, which is kind of interesting because we see this in the governmental area. So Green Book talks about a system of internal controls. COSO just has this concept of internal control. And so the extant standard was really based off of COSO. And so it's kind of interesting how all these different standards that are sort of overlap. So when we think about this, we need to understand how management has set up its system of internal controls to help us view where we need to focus our attention, right? So internal controls, if we think about it, control risk is one of the biggest features, right? RMM is made up of inherent risk and control risk. So we need to understand the internal controls so that we know where we need to focus. A lot of people think the only driver of our response to risk and material misstatement is to our inherent risk, but that's not true. We're supposed to respond to both the inherent risk and the control risk. So we need to understand the controls to identify where there could be risk. Even if we don't test the operating effectiveness of them, if we know there's a design flaw, we need to be responsive. And so if you've done some of the best practices and if you've taken some of the more difficult risk assessment classes, these are things we've been preaching for some time, just weren't interpreted that way from the standard. So they're being a little bit clearer here. But if you've ever taken one of my risk assessment classes, we always focus on how control risk drives our response. And now we're just being extra clear by stating it in the standard. So looking at these as a driver of our response. It also makes it clear that the overall requirement for understanding it is achieved through requirements that address the understanding of each of the components. So we're going to retain our 5 components of internal control. The order of them has changed a little bit. When we get to the definition, I'll show you that. But we're going to be required to really have certain key understandings. In fact, they're going to tell us what we're going to be looking for in our internal control structure. So you're going to notice some changes in terminology. We're going to see a little bit of movement around. The term internal control as used in the extant standard is actually now the definition updated of this definition of a system of internal control, and we're going to get a new definition of the word control. It also addresses explicitly those 5 interrelated components. So here is our definition of a system of internal control. So the system designed, implemented, and maintained by those charged with governance, management, and other personnel. So you kind of see that the concept here, to provide reasonable assurance about the achievement of the entity's objectives with regard to the reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, and compliance with applicable laws and regulations. So you can kind of see here this COSO definition of a control being now used for a system of internal controls. So instead of being policies and procedures, it's focusing on the system. And then it talks about for the purposes of GAS, the system includes 5 interrelated. So we have our control environment, our risk assessment. Normally, when we go through this, we would have our information system, but next is going to come the monitoring. So we're going to talk about how they renamed and reorganized this. And so we're going to have indirect and direct controls. And so these are the indirect being grouped together. And then the next 2, information system and communication, and then control activities, which are going to be our direct controls. All right, controls are policies or procedures, which is derived from our extant standard, that an entity establishes to achieve the control objectives of management or those charged with governance. So we have our system, and then we have the policies and procedures that are going to be used to achieve those objectives. And so policies are statements of what should or should not be done, right? So this is your policy manual, right? This is the yeses and the nos. This could be documented. It could just be explicitly stated. It doesn't have to be an actual manual, or implied through actions and decisions. So again, we're not looking at levels of formality here. Procedures are the actions, right? So the policy is what you can and cannot do, and the procedures are how you implement those policies. So as I mentioned, they introduced this concept of the direct versus indirect. We maintained that 5, components are appropriate. However, we're now looking at how do we need to understand them? And when we think about it, control environment, risk assessment, and our monitoring process typically do not directly impact the risk material misstatement at the assertion level, right? These are typically what we call entity level controls. And so instead of focusing on them as assertion responses, they're indirect controls. Information system and communication, as well as control activities, are direct, right? These are typically going to address RMM at the assertion level. And so we're going to have responses at this level. So you can see here that focus on IT being a direct type of internal control. So when we look at the change here, we are going to have a requirement to understand the components through identification and understanding of certain controls that address RMM. And it actually creates a list of the types of controls that, if applicable, the ASB believes that we are going to have to consider to be relevant, right? So they're always relevant to the risk material misstatement. And this is sort of our starting point. These are the control activities that we are required to look at. However, it then goes on to say, use your professional judgment. There could be other controls that you need to evaluate the design and the determine whether they're implemented. So they use the term D&I, designed and implemented, to be responsive to RMM. But these are the minimum, right? This is what we expect you guys to do. And then you take it to that next level and you are you would look for other controls. So when we think about this, this is being very explicit about the control environment, very, very specific about the controls that we are required to identify. And so hopefully reducing some of the diversity in practice. So this is paragraph 26, which lists, I'm not going to read it to you, but these are the ones you are required to evaluate the design of these control activities. Again, we don't have to determine that everything's been implemented. That's still an option. It's not a requirement, but they're going to drive into certain items that we're required to go through. As I mentioned, because of the IT being just fundamental to how a business works, we are required to understand the IT to gain a high-level understanding of the nature and complexity, and then to identify the risks related to it. And there's an entire appendix, Appendix E, on how do we consider IT. It does talk about scalability here. If your client's using a commercial off-the-shelf, can't make any changes to a basic functionality, your response can be typically more limited than in those that are using really fancy ERP systems. So we talked about control risk, right? One of the elements of RMM. The other big changes in the area of inherent risk, right? So both inherent risk and control risk make up our risk material misstatement. And again, some new concepts and some new definitions. That seems to be pretty consistent. So one of the things they're going to introduce, which we've seen before, SAS 134 introduces this concept, which is the concept of an inherent risk factor. So these are things that you have to consider, and they're more explicitly stated now. So inherent risk factors are characteristics of events or conditions that affect susceptibility to misstatement, whether due to fraud or error, of an assertion about a class of transactions, account balance, or disclosures before we consider controls. Remember, inherent risk is done separately. So inherent risk, you have to do it without the consideration of control. Control risk is done standalone, and then we combine to get our RMM. So what are some of the inherent risk factors we need to consider? They could be qualitative or quantitative and include complexity, subjectivity, change, uncertainty, or susceptibility to management bias or fraud. And you're also going to see an appendix really breaking out and diving into what these inherent risk factors look like. Another change that I noticed and I think is going to be really interesting is the change in the definition of a relevant assertion. So the extant standard says a relevant assertion is a financial statement assertion that has a reasonable possibility of containing a misstatement that would cause the financial statements to be materially misstated. Now it's an assertion about a class of transactions, account balance, or disclosure is relevant when it has an identified risk of material misstatement. So if you've identified a risk, then that is a relevant assertion. And if you've ever been in one of my risk assessment classes, this is how I teach risk assessment. So I don't think this is a huge change, but it's a lot of clarity, and I think will reduce some of the inconsistencies that we see out there. They continue with what's in the extant standard, which is the determination of whether an assertion is relevant is made before we consider any control risk, right? So we only focus on inherent risk when we're thinking about a relevant assertion. We also update the definition of the significant class of transactions, account balance, or disclosures, and we focus on it where there's one or more relevant assertions. That makes it a significant class of transactions. Another new concept that they introduced is this concept of a spectrum of inherent risk, and that is defined a little bit broader. And it basically says inherent risk factors, right? So subjectivity, et cetera, individually or in combination affect inherent risk to varying degrees, right? So you might have more subjectivity, you might have more complexity, you might have less fraud risk, right? So there's kind of these varying degrees. And so as a result, the inherent risk will be higher for some assertions than for others. The degree to which inherent risk varies is referred to as a spectrum, right? So a movement along. So lower risk, higher risk, and then you have somewhere in between. The relative degrees of the likelihood and magnitude are what is going to be the impact here. So this is something that they've been focused on. We're kind of continuing this concept. I don't think that a spectrum is like, rocking anyone's world, but it is a concept that I think might change how entities consider their risk. So technically, they require a separate assessment of inherent risk and control risk. Now, most of you are probably saying, but I've been doing that for a long time, and that is true. That was always the intent. However, there was ways of reading the extant standard to imply that all you really needed to do was get a risk of material misstatement, and you didn't have to have a separate assessment of inherent risk and control risk. So now it's explicitly clear that for all risk of material misstatement at the assertion level, you must have a separate inherent risk and a separate control risk assessment. In addition, it's also now explicit, again, I don't think this is going to rock anyone's world, that control risk is always at maximum if you don't test the operating effectiveness. You can't take credit, for example, for a walkthrough. You can't reduce control risk below maximum if you haven't actually tested the operating effectiveness. This has already also been incorporated into SAS 143. So when SAS 143 came out, they decided to include this requirement of risk factors, of a separate assessment of risk, of focused on this on the control operations, but it wasn't in the actual exit 315. And so because 540 came out first, they wanted to make sure they got it in there because it's going to be effective, and then we're going to put it in there for everyone else. So when we think about a significant risk, the extant standard focuses on a response, right? Something that requires a special audit consideration. So it's focused on what you have to do. Now we're going to focus it on the nature of the risk. So a significant risk has a new definition. So it's an identified risk of material misstatement for which the assessment of inherent risk is close to the upper end of the spectrum of inherent risk due to the degree to which inherent risk factors affect the combination of the likelihood and the magnitude of potential misstatement. So again, using almost all the terminology that we've learned so far today, this is going to be on that upper end. It's a higher risk. Now, we've kind of always said this a higher risk in our interpretation. It needed a special audit consideration, but instead of focusing on the response, it's focusing in on the risk, right? The nature of the risk. And also says that, it could have low likelihood, but if the magnitude is very high, right, it's the combination of them, not just one or the other, but how you bring them together. The other way it could be a significant risk is that some other AUC section says so. A new addition, which is also in SAS 143 that's being incorporated into this proposal, is what we call a stand back provision. You have to kind of step back at the end and say, did I get this right? So for material classes of transactions, account balances, or disclosures that have not been determined to be significant classes, then the auditor should evaluate whether that determination remains appropriate. So there's that sort of step back and say, did I get this right? Did my assessment, turn out to be accurate at the end of this? So in terms of our response, the auditor is required to design and perform substantive procedures for all relevant assertions related to each significant, instead of, you'll notice here, material, that focus on significant, class of transactions, account balance, and disclosure. So kind of the assessment of inherent risk and control risk being updated, and then this is the response. As I mentioned, quite a few different appendices here. So we have our consideration of our understanding the entity. I really like this appendix, so take a look. Understanding inherent risk factors, so really explaining what does it mean for each of those different factors identified in the standard. Understanding the entity's system of internal control, so a little bit more clarification here. Then looking at the internal audit function, and then understanding IT, and then general IT control. So you can see that focus on IT. So when do we expect this? It would be effective, again, if this is a pass. Right now it's a proposal for audits of periods ending on or after December 15th of 2023. So we have some time. No, you can't ask yourself, are you going to be retired yet? That's my most popular question. No, that's not one of the things that we think about. We want to be focused on getting this through. So we want to encourage you to respond to this. I think it would be helpful if you took a look at it. I know 200 pages can be overwhelming, but this is going to be some pretty significant changes. So I want to make sure that everyone has thought about it. So I apologize for going 20 minutes long. It was really just trying to make sure that you understood the significance of these changes. So I really appreciate you guys sticking with it to the end. So thank you guys so much for joining me. And I hope to see you on a future blog. Have a great day, guys. Bye-bye.